The topic today is actually something that if you've ever studied with Rabbi Ginzburg or been in any of our classes on Torah Nefesh, you'll recognize it immediately. In fact, it may be so already known to you that for some people it may be something that will just be a review. Sometimes new things come up, but I couldn't help myself because it's such a basic thing that's connected to this week's parsha, and one of the topics that Rav has talked about for so many years, so many times, and it's become a staple of his approach to psychology. And what I'm referring to is actually not directly in the parsha, though it was chosen as a continuation of the parsha. And what I'm talking about is the Haftarah, the selection from the prophets. And this week's Haftarah is the famous story of David bringing the Ark of the Covenant up to Jerusalem, chapter 6 of 2 Samuel. We're going to look at it in a moment inside. The topic itself is what is called in Chassidus lowliness, or in Hebrew shiflut. And it's a very large topic in and of itself, but the concept is very simple. Unfortunately, a lot of times, even though it's a simple concept, it's taken in a very negative way. And really, that's not what it was meant to do. It wasn't meant to put somebody down. Lowly right away sounds to all of us, even in Hebrew, shiflut, somebody who's shafal, sounds like something that's very derogatory, negative maybe. But that's not the intent at all. There was no such intention. Rather, because the practical advice of Hasidic psychology is that we have to look at ourselves as complex beings, as having different psyches, which are actually vying and positioning themselves as who will win, who will be more than the other. Then we've got this issue of how to deal with what we call the lower self. So just to say it in general terms, if you've ever studied Tanya, then you've seen that every person, whether Jew or not, has actually two different psyches. And one is called the lower psyche, it's called the animal soul. And the other one is called the higher psyche. In a Jew, it's called the divine soul, nefesh elokit. And in a non-Jew, called the intellectual soul. And in your case, we have two different identities, as it were, two different ways in which we identify ourselves. So much of our life we may be spending pursuing our lower identity, our lower self, what's called the animal soul. And the animal soul is interested in self-preservation, it's interested in material success. But more than anything else, the animal soul is interested in the mundane aspects of life. The divine soul, or the intellectual soul, can go beyond that. And it's interested in something higher. As I had to go somewhere today, a pretty long drive. And on the way, I thought that maybe, we've been discussing God the wrong way, maybe. Whenever people hear about God, the first thing they hear is either he judges me, or second thing is he has all kinds of demands from me. And I've always felt that even though that is true, there's nothing incorrect about that per se, but that's not how the higher self sees things. The divine soul, the intellectual soul, can connect with God as being simply what the word itself in English means, which is good. Every one of us wants to be good. Every one of us wants to do good things. We want to use our life for the good. So why is it that we associate the good so separately from God? God literally means good. As I was driving, I suddenly felt I really love the good. It's not just when I say I love God, I don't really mean God is the creator. Because God as the creator is sort of like, what have you done for me lately? Okay, what has God done for me lately? He's created the world and I'm enjoying it. But a more inner sense of loving something is pursuing something. And what do I love that I pursue? I pursue the good in my life, in every aspect. I want to lead a good life. I want to live a good life. I want to act in a good way. I want to have a good impact on the world. That's what it means to love God. To love God literally means to love the good. And every human being, I think, understands that. And every human being wants to get to that, wants to achieve that. And that's the nature of the divine soul. That's its true nature. That it understands the good. It understands what is good. Now we just have to define what is good. So we might come and say, well, we can define it using philosophy, and we can define it in some philosophy department at, I don't know, at Columbia University. Or you can come and say, whatever philosophers understand is fine, but it's very fleeting. It's very limited to how currently we see the good. But if you're looking at what is universal good, what is good from the beginning of creation until now, what is good that will really transform the world, I think you can understand that if God himself would tell us what is good, what is the path to reach the good, what is the way to achieve the good, we would probably want to follow that much more than any philosophy department. So in a certain sense, that's what Torah is about. Torah is about God revealing to us what the good is. And that's true also psychologically. It's true in the sense that if I want to lead a good life, if I don't want to get hung up by the negative things that we all have in our lives, I'm called upon to learn from the prophets, first of all from Moses, but from all the prophets, how they define in their prophecy what the good is. So the story that we're going to look at now from King David is a very essential and seminal story about how to get over the ups and downs in life. It's really what it's about, and mostly how not to fall down, because we all fall down when we have failure. The ups and downs of life are our successes and our failures. And King David says himself, in Hebrew, it's Kol mishbarecha vegalecha alai avaru. All of your waves, all of your crashing waves have passed over me, he says to God. Meaning I've experienced the ebb and the tide. I've experienced the ups and downs more than my fair share. And I've seen it all. And I've learned over time how not to let the failures pull me down, how not to drown, how not to miss a stride even, not to miss a single step even when things don't go right. How to do that. And that's the secret of what we're going to see now. Now, the amazing thing is, why was this chosen as this parsha's Haftarah? Ostensibly, it has something to do with Aaron losing his two sons. I mean, imagine Aaron is at the pinnacle of his career. He's now being anointed. He and his 4 sons are being anointed as priests. Aaron is becoming the high priest in our parsha. Our parsha discusses the final day of the 7 days of filling their hands, meaning anointing them to becoming priests. The 8th day, it's called the 8th day parsha. Some years it's read 8 times. It's also an important thing about it. But Aaron reaches the pinnacle of any kind of divine service that any person has ever achieved. And on that day that he reaches that pinnacle, he goes from the highest place to the lowest place when his 2 elder sons are struck down by God because of the improper use of the incense that they performed. So at the highest point of his life, he's suddenly cast down into the lowest place that a father can be in, losing 2 sons on the same day. And Aaron deals with it in a way that is commendable, of course, but it goes certainly far beyond that even. So I think in an attempt to explain to us how is it possible that Aaron was able to navigate such a tremendous dissonance between the height of being anointed as the high priest and then losing his 2 sons, I think for that reason, the rabbis chose this particular selection from the prophets. And again, it's in 2 Samuel chapter 6. And we'll start reading it right now. To do that, I'll share the screen, and then I'll be able to test my eyesight if you can see as far as the screen is. Okay, I hope this is the right screen. Just a moment. I'm not sure why you can't see it. I think you're not seeing it, right? Just a second. I'm going to try again. Not sure why that didn't work. Grant access. I'm having some kind of, I don't know exactly what the problem is. Privacy. Camera. I should have checked this more a moment ago. Sorry. Let me see if that solved the problem. Okay, I'll try again one more time. If it doesn't work, then I'm just going to read to you. And I don't know what the issue is. I'm sorry. Not sure what the problem is. Okay, I'm just going to read it to you. If anybody wants to see it, just go to sephariah.org and go to 2 Samuel chapter 6. So I'm going to read it from there. Okay, here we go. So it says here, David again assembled all the chosen men of Israel. after David was able to secure his kingdom, after Saul was dead for a few years. He had been the king, I think, at this stage for 7 years. And he set up an infrastructure throughout his kingdom. Then David and all the troops that were with him set out from Baalim of Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, to which the name was attached, the name of God, Havaya of hosts, enthroned on the cherubim. They loaded the ark of God onto a new cart and conveyed it from the house of Abdav, which was on the hill, and Avinadav's sons, Uzzah and Ahi, guided the new cart. So the picture we have here is that David is already living in Jerusalem, in what's called the city of David. And I think we may have discussed it at some point. David's you could call it his reason for existence, his reason for being a king was his dream of building the temple. That was why he became the king. That was his main reason for thinking even of leading the Jewish people, because it had been already 400 years since they had come into the land of Israel, and they had still not built a permanent temple for God. Until that time, the tabernacle, which had been in use in the wilderness, had been turned into a half-permanent structure. And post a link, I can try. I'm going to put a link in the chat. So if somebody wants to try to see it there, maybe see if I can do this. Do it to everybody, everyone. Okay, so I posted the link in the chat if you want to read it with me. So returning to David's predicament, he's already living in Jerusalem and there's no even beginning of building the temple. And for David, this is the reason for his existence. So as a first act, he decides to bring the Ark of the Covenant, which is no longer in the semi-permanent structure of the tabernacle. Rather, after it had been taken to war against the Philistines, it ended up in a place called, as we saw here, in a place called Giv'ah. It says here on the hill, but it's really the name of a place. And from there, it's not very far from Jerusalem. It's about a 10-kilometer trip. He's going to bring it to Jerusalem itself. But David does something that doesn't make any sense. And what he does is he places the ark on a cart, on a wagon. Now, anybody who's read anything in the Bible knows that the ark is carried by foot. It's carried by people, by the Levites. It's not supposed, or the priests, it's not supposed to be carried really by the Levites. It's not supposed to be carried on a wagon. You don't put it on a cart. But they did that. The sages discuss a lot of things about why that happened, why they made this mistake. But in the end, it's like a kindergarten mistake. There's no good explanation for why they did that. But something terrible happens along the way. So they conveyed it to Avinadav's house on the hill. And again, it's on the wagon. And Avinadav was right. And two of his sons, and Achio, were walking behind the cart, guiding it. And the cart was being pulled by cows, by oxen. They walked, Uzzah walked alongside the ark of God, and Achio walking in front of the ark. Meanwhile, David and all the house of Israel danced before the Lord to the sound of all kinds of cypress wood instruments with lyres, harps, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. But then when they came to the threshing floor of Nachon, Uzzah reached out for the ark of God and grasped it meaning he tried to hold it, for the oxen had stumbled. He suddenly saw that the cows, the oxen that were were pulling the wagon, the cart, had stumbled. He was afraid that the ark would fall off. The Lord was incensed at Uzzah, and God struck him down on the spot for his indiscretion, and he died there beside the ark of God. So here we have a very similar situation to Aaron's situation. King David is at the moment, at the pinnacle of his career as the king. He's making the first step in building the permanent residence for God in Jerusalem, but bringing art to Jerusalem. And he's got Aaron with him, and they're all dancing and giving honor to the ark and leading it. And suddenly, in the middle of all this festivity, God kills one of the Levites that is guiding the cart. And when I teach this, I usually say, I mean, there's no greater disgrace for a king than for something like that to happen. Imagine for a moment that you put all of your clout on building the temple, and you said to everybody, look, we have to bring the ark. And as you're bringing it, God says, no. The killing of Uzzah is like saying, like God stomping down and saying, no, there's something wrong with this. You're not worthy of it. Now, technically, again, it's a simple issue. You're not supposed to put the ark on a cart, and you're not supposed to touch the ark. The way you carry the ark is by the poles that were on their shoulders. They never touched the ark, they only held the poles. But here, Uzzah touches the ark itself, something that's not to be done. So it's just a technical issue, as it were. But you have to understand the position that David is in. Imagine that you have just started your company, and you go for the first day to try to let everybody into the premises, and the janitor says, you can't come in. You didn't pay your rent. This is not yours. What are you doing here? We don't know who you are. It's basically the same thing. Everybody's waiting for all this transition that David was so bent on, and suddenly it all stops dead in its tracks. So that's failure. That's failure at the highest level. That's failure that, it's sort of like the Challenger blowing up. NASA never recovered. And when Columbia blew up, that was the end of it. You never recover from these things. It's like everything you did, you put all your eggs in the basket, and the basket fell, and all the eggs were cracked. So it's not surprising that the next verse, verse 8, says, David was distressed because they had inflicted a breach upon Uzzah, the man who had grasped the ark. And that place was named Peretz Uzzah, as it is still called to this day. So it's not surprising that they were distressed. He just lost everything, at least in the eyes of the people. He's probably not going to do what he thought he was going to do. He thought he was going to build the temple and bring the ark to Jerusalem, let alone build. But the amazing thing is that David is not distressed because of the failure. That is, how do I know that he's not distressed because of the failure? Because the next, David was afraid of the Lord that day. He said, how can I bring the ark of the Lord to me? How can I? David understands that this is a rebuke. It's not just a failure. And it causes him to fear God, not to do what most of us usually do when somebody rains on our parade, which is to cast the guilt somewhere else. David takes full responsibility. And he says, I'm not worthy of the ark coming to me. I'm not worthy of this yet. You have to understand how surprising this reaction is. This is exactly the opposite from the reaction we usually see by people. What do we usually hear? Well, if it was me there, I'd say, Uzzah, you idiot, what did you do? my kids always get angry that whenever they fall or something happens to them and whatever, and I get really upset, because something happened to them. So I say, how could you fall? What do you how can I fall? Say something nice at least. That's how I am. Yeah. Because you're trying to make up for the problem somehow. You're trying to solve the problem somehow. Best scenario is, it wasn't my child. God, how could you do this in the middle of what we're doing for you? Who are we doing this? I mean, that's what David is thinking. Who am I doing this for? Am I doing it for me? I'm doing it for you. So you couldn't overlook one small mistake that somebody touched the ark? That's the big deal. Everything has to stop now. But that, as we'll see, that's the product of being lowly. Being lowly means understanding that I don't necessarily deserve what I think I do. We have in the back of our minds always the lower self, the animal soul, is constantly telling us, you deserve what you have, and you should get more, because the animal soul wants to ensure our survivability. It wants to ensure that we're taken care of. And so it thinks that the way the world should work is that you do X, you get a reward. And so if I'm to legitimize the rewards that I've received from God, my home, my family, my health, the money in my bank, whatever it is, it must mean that I'm a very good person. Because otherwise, how can you explain the fact that I've received all these things? But that's not true necessarily. Rather, how should I see it? When I'm lowly, I realize that everything that I have, whether I've worked for it or not, in the end, is a gift from the Almighty. It's a gift. He didn't have to give it to me. The whole world doesn't have to exist. All the more so, the opportunity for me to even work to serve God is not to be taken as a given. You can't just assume that you have a God-given right to even serve God. You could not. I could be born in a different time, in a different place, in a different body, without these opportunities. Oh, but there's even more. Apart from the fact that everything that I have is a gift, I've also done a lot of bad things. Maybe not on purpose, but I'm not a consummate tzaddik. I'm not a righteous individual. I'm far from it. I have in me my lower self, which is constantly worried only about one thing, which is about me. And so I've done many things that were improper. So who says, and where is it written, and where's the guarantee that I should be able, says David, to bring the ark of God to Jerusalem? I want to. I would certainly like to, but it's a privilege. There's nothing that promises me or guarantees that even when I set out to do something for God, that I'll be successful. And if I'm not, who's to blame? Well, not God. And Uzzah's not to blame. So David has only one other option. It's me. Truthfully, it was him, because he overlooked that simple fact that we talked about in the beginning, that you can't take the ark on a cart. You have to take it by hand, on foot. That mistake, we said, is like a kindergarten mistake. Like every child knows this. So what happened? Why didn't you know this, David? Who knows? We don't know. But it was an oversight. And that led to the whole problem. But David doesn't try to look for somebody to blame, because he's able to deal with his failures. His failures don't make him crash down, as we'll see in a moment. They don't feel to him like it's the end of the world. He accepts the fact that as a human being who has an animal soul, he is prone to make mistakes, and nothing is guaranteed. And when the mistakes do happen, there's only one person to blame for them. And again, blame here is not self-flagellation. It doesn't have to be that I'm looking at myself in a negative way. I just accept the fact that I may not be cut out for all the things that I think I am. We just came out of Pesach. We didn't get a chance to meet on Pesach because it was still Yontiv in America, so we didn't have a class last Monday. But I wanted to talk last week about the message that the matzah gives. And the message that's usually associated with the matzah is a message of lowliness. The idea being that leavened bread, that the leavening of the bread, the rising of it, is the opposite of lowliness, that the matzah remains lowly. There's a very interesting explanation about the difference between leavened bread and matzah. In Hebrew, leavened bread is chametz. Everybody probably knows this. And matzah is matzah. The only difference in terms of the lettering, the way these two words are written, chametz is written chet mem tzadik, and matzah is written mem tzadik hey. So the only difference is the chet and the hey. The letter chet looks like this. It's like a doorway. The hey is almost exactly the same, except that the left post is cut. So it's like hanging. So there's an opening on the left. The chet, the closed doorway, is part of the chametz, the leavened bread, where there is hubris, where there is a feeling of self-pride. The matzah has the hay, where there's this opening on the left side. What's the difference between the two of these two letters? So the explanation in Chassidus that's brought is that the opening in the hay, meaning in the matzah, is a feeling, now get this, that I'm always prone to sin. I'm always prone to sin. What does that mean? I can't trust myself. I have human failings, And when I recognize that, I realize that many, many times in my life, I've let myself down. And I didn't act the way I thought I should. And afterwards, I was upset at myself. But that's okay, because that's how I am. I'm a human being. That's lowliness. Understanding that. The verse in the Torah is, Lapetach chatat rovetz. It's the words that God said to Cain after Cain got upset that God didn't accept his sacrifice. Why are you getting upset? You failed. It's true. God didn't want it. But understand, there's no guarantees. There's no 100%. Just because you decided to do something good, it doesn't have to work out the way you wanted it to. Because you're a human being, you have failings. Not everything will work the way you want it to. It's natural. It's normal. You don't have to take it so hard. You just have to accept it. Okay. If you don't get 100 on a test, so I don't know, maybe the first time we took a test in our lives, we thought we would get 100 and we were really upset. But then as we got used, at least I got used to getting 80s and 85s and maybe sometimes once in a while 90. It was really great, but that was it. It never went any higher. And so I got used to it because I understood that I have limits. It doesn't make me a bad person. It just says I have my limits. That's true also in serving God. That's true in doing everything. There's no couple that doesn't ever argue. There's nobody who never says a mean thing. They also, if you are, you're a consummate tzaddik or something from a different planet. I don't know who you are. But a normal person makes all these mistakes. And so to deal with them, you have to accept the fact that lapeta chatat rovetz, like Cain. Understand, the fact that God didn't want your sacrifice, didn't accept it, is not to say that you should stop serving God. It's to say that this time it wasn't what it wasn't the right thing. You need to work on it. Don't give up. But I want you to look at what happens when you turn these two letters upside down. When you turn the chet upside down, you turn the hey upside down. So what do you get? You get two cups. But one of the cups has a hole. Instead of being an opening on the left side on the top, when you turn the hey upside down, you get a cup that has a hole on the bottom. Now, everybody knows the famous question, is your cup half full or half empty? Which is it? Well, some people will say my cup is half full. Some people will say my cup is half empty. Nobody's cup is full to all the way to the limit, right? There's nobody whose cup is full all the way. Is there anybody here? Anybody want to raise their hand and say their cup is full all the way up? You can't be. The sages say a person doesn't leave this world and half of his cravings in his hand. You can't even get to half of what you wanted. So obviously you always feel that it's half empty. The question is, what do you feel more? Do you feel more that it's half empty, or do you feel more that it's half full? So when I see people on a personal basis, I tend to ask them this question: what's your cup? Is it half empty or half full? And then I ask another question that I learned from my wife, which is, what part of what I just said is fictitious? Which part is imaginary? Again, this image of the cup being half full or half empty. What's imaginary about this whole thing? So I don't know, think about it for a second. What do you think is imaginary? But what I try to get people to see is that what's imaginary is not whether it's half empty or half full. The cup itself is imaginary. How do you draw the cup? How do you imagine it? There's no cup. There's no cup here. There's no glass. You're imagining it. So how do you imagine it? Why are you imagining it half empty in the first place? Is it really half empty? Is your life really half empty? it's only half empty because your animal soul tells you that you haven't received half of what you deserve. But if just for a moment you think about it, that, wait a minute, I can draw the cup any way I want. I can take my life and draw the cup in such a way that, as King David says in Psalms, kosi revaya, which means, and I always like to say that this is one of the few instances in which the English translation is better than the original Hebrew. My cup overfloweth. Who says you have to draw the cup so that it's only half full? Maybe this is as good as it gets. What do you mean as good as it gets? It's going to get better. But right now, this is the pinnacle. Right now, I'm full to the brim. To the rim? I don't remember what. It's probably some mistake of mine. But it's full all the way up. The reason that I even see that it's half empty is because I imagine that somehow it should be different. Somehow I deserve more. Who said? My animal soul says so. My lower self says so. But because of that, when I meet with failure, so it's not just that, oh, I'm not only am I not full anymore, I've just hit rock bottom. But even in failure, my cup is completely full. This is as good as I can do right now. I can't do any better. I have failings. I have limits. That's lowliness. And King David teaches that lowliness. And so what is the next thing that he says? He says, first of all, he has fear of God. He says, I'm not worthy of bringing the ark to me yet. I still have to do some work. It's not that God doesn't want me to do this. Of course he wants me to do it. I don't lose faith. I don't lose my direction. I don't lose my purpose. I just realize that the time is not right yet. Why is it not right? Because I need to change things. Says King David in the next verse, verse 10. So David would not bring the ark of the Lord to his place in the city of David. Instead, he diverted it to the house of Obed Edom the Gittite. He said, it's not time yet. And he was upset. What was he upset? He was distressed about the fact that he wasn't ready yet. He was distressed that he had caused Uzzah to die because of his mistakes. That's a leader. But he can only admit his mistakes in this way because of his lowliness, because he doesn't think he's perfect. Because he thinks his cup overfloweth, even when he makes a mistake. This is as much as God can give him at this moment. God wants to give more, but you're not ready yet for it. And it's okay, because that's how human beings are. They're lowly. We have, again, going back now to the image of the cup between the chet and the hay, we have a hole in our cup. Now imagine that. The cup is as full as it can be. Sorry, just 1 second. I forgot to turn my phone off. The cup is as full as it can be, even though I have a hole at the bottom. Now that's a trick. My cup, not only am I imagining it the wrong way, I think it's a lot bigger. I deserve a lot more than what I have. But I think that it's whole. And suddenly comes this image of matzah with the hay at the end and tells me I'm not whole at all. I have a hole. I'm not whole with a W. I'm whole with an H. What's my hole? My shortcomings, my transgressions, the things I did wrong in my life. And yet, my cup overfloweth. That's how King David sees his life. So he says, if it's not time yet, what do? So I'll take the ark and put it in safekeeping until I get a sign that it's time to do what I intended to do in the first place, to bring it to Jerusalem. So the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his whole household. So King David gets a report. It was reported to King David. The Lord has blessed Obed-Edom's house and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. Again, this is all the Haftarah. This is all the selection from the prophets for this week's Torah reading. So David went to Jerusalem and he waited, but I'm sure he didn't just twiddle his thumbs. He prayed and he changed himself and he worked on himself and he reviewed the laws of how do you transport the ark, and he saw the mistake that he had made. These were all things that he did in the interim. But after 3 months, he hears that the ark is no longer a reason for death, it's now a reason for blessing again. Again, the blessing was that everybody in Obed-Edom's household gave birth. Even those women who weren't able to give birth before, they had children. So they knew that the ark was now blessing. So David takes this as a sign. And think about it again. Imagine that something doesn't work out for you. Famous story about the fox who wants to get the grapes. One of Aesop's fables. So what does the fox say in the end after he can't get the grapes? There must be bad grapes anyway. That's how most of us react to failure. If I failed, why would I try again? Because I'm upset. I don't want to try again. I have to blame somebody. It can't be that I was the problem. But when you accept that through lowliness, you can accept that, okay, I had an issue. I think I've solved it. Let me try again. Then everything looks different. I realize that on the way to success, there's going to be a lot of failure. The only way I'm going to be able to deal with this failure is through lowliness, through understanding that I don't necessarily deserve the success yet. It's not just capitalism. It's not just you have to work hard. The answer could continue to be no my whole life, but I'll never stop trying because I really do want to serve God. So even if there's something that I haven't been able to do, there's every year when the year starts, you make all these resolutions. I make a lot of resolutions also. Most of them are which books I'm going to finish this year to learn, to do. So this year, because Rav Steinsaltz passed away, I had this crazy idea that in 12 months, I would go over his entire Talmud. Crazy idea. It's not so impossible. It's an easy year because there's 13 months this year. It means 7 pages of Talmud a day. Not the end of the world. I could do it. I've done it before. But there's days like today, it's now almost 11 o'clock in Israel. I haven't even learned one page yet. So it means that after I finish the class, we'll see. Either I'll stay up or not. I have at least an hour and a half, 2 hours of work. Oh, just reading. I'm not even going to study it, just to read it. But that's part of what I wanted. So let's say I'm not able to do it. So do I give up? No, tomorrow I'll try to do more. But if I don't, so I'm behind. Okay. So next day I'll try to do a little bit more and try to catch up. But even if I don't, I can't stop. Why? Because nobody promises me that I'll be able to do what I set out to do, but I still would like to do it. I still understand the value of it. Even if I utterly and completely fail, it still has value in my eyes. So I don't want to stop. And if I fail, fine. I'll continue on. I'll try in a different way. I'll do something else to commemorate his memory. Whatever it is. The only way I can accept that is because I've grown to understand that I have shortcomings, I have failures. I'm not going to be able to do everything the right way. And by the way, I once saw a movie where somebody was playing the president of the United States, and he had a tough conversation with some scientist who told him that so-and-so would happen. And he says to him, but that didn't happen. So what do you have to say? So the scientist says, I'm sorry, I was wrong. So the guy who's playing the president of the United States says, like in a really stern voice, do you know how many times I've heard those words in this office? And the guy's afraid because he's probably going to say, I've heard that 1,000,000 times. What are you telling me? He says, I haven't heard it even once. Nobody's willing to admit that they were wrong. Why? Because we don't have lowliness. Because admitting that I'm wrong is a failure. I can't admit my failures. But that's what King David is teaching here. And when you can admit the fact that it's not necessarily guaranteed that you'll succeed, you can continue on in spite of the failure. And that's exactly what David does. Thereupon David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David amid rejoicing. And this time he does it right. When the bearers of the ark of the Lord had moved forward 6 paces, he said, meaning the bearers, meaning they're now carrying it on their shoulders the right way. Obviously, he did his homework. He sacrificed an ox and a fatling, which is a fat ox. David whirled with all his might before the Lord. David was girt with a linen ephod, meaning he was wearing the garment of prophets. This is a big deal. We can't get into it right now. As the ark of the Lord entered the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, his first wife, she's the daughter of the previous king. She looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and whirling before the Lord. He's dancing in front of the ark. And she despised him for it. Why? Because Saul would never have done something like that. Her father would never have lowered himself to that position of dancing in front of the ark before everybody while wearing this special garment. It's a disgrace. It's self-deprecating. That's how she sees it. It's not honorable for a king to do this. In any case, they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it up in its place inside the tent which David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before the Lord. When David finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and the offerings of well-being, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, and he distributed among the people, the entire multitude of Israel, men and women alike, to each a loaf of bread, a cake made in a pan, and a raisin cake. Then all the people left for their homes. I don't know why they say a raisin cake. The way I learned it is what it means is a piece of meat. In any case, this is where the Haftarah really ends for the Ashkenazim. The Sephardim continue on a little bit more, at least two more verses. The 2 more verses are very important. David went home to greet his household, and Michal, the daughter of Saul, his first wife, came out to meet David and said, hasn't the king of Israel done himself honor today? She's being very cynical. Exposing himself today in the sight of the maidservants of his subjects, as one of the riffraff might expose himself. She feels that what David did in front of the ark was unbecoming for a king. She says, my father would not have done this. But David is lowly, and he says, before God, I have no honor. I'm no one before God. I'm like everybody else. Yes, I'm like a maidservant. That's all I am. Again, his lowliness is his most important trait as a leader. The trait that allows him not to give up after failing, the trait that allows him to take responsibility for his failings, and the trait that makes sure that in the end, he attributes all his success to God's kindness and not to his prowess. That's what lowliness gives a person. It gives him the most important faculty for being successful even when failing. So that's what Michal, his wife, says to him. David answered Michal and said, "It was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father," he's giving it to her here, "and all his family, including you, and appointed me ruler over the Lord's people, I will dance before the Lord." He says, when it's before God, I have no self-claimed honor. I am just like everybody else. No different. And he continues and he says something amazing. He says, "And dishonor myself even more and be lowly in my own eyes." That's where, this is the verse that's always quoted when David reveals that his most important trait is his ability to be lowly. I just made a big mistake. I left the door open and I woke up my little son. So he just came stomping in, closed my door very quietly because he didn't want to disturb the Zoom. But said, what do I go and do now? I go and tell him, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. I was so engrossed in trying to set up everything here that I forgot to close the door. So you're going to have a tough time waking up tomorrow. Is that lowly? No, it's just accepting the fact that as a parent, you make all these mistakes. But for David, this is the epitome of what it means to be a king. Now, I've mentioned this before, I think, in one of the classes. I say it a lot, that we all need to be kings of our own lives. We all have to be the leaders of our own lives. Nobody else is going to be the sovereign for us. Nobody else is going to lead our lives for us. We may feel that there's a lot of things pushing us, but in the end, we're the only ones who can take charge of where our lives are going. So we're all kings and queens in that respect. And to be a king, to be a queen, what David teaches is that the most important quality is lowliness, shiflut. The ability to see myself not just as maybe not even deserving of what I have, but that what I have is a gift in spite of all my failings, that my cup overfloweth in spite of the fact that it has a huge hole on the bottom. And somehow God still keeps it all together for me. And when I can see it that way, I don't have to blame anybody for my failings. I see them as my own. I don't have to give up on achieving my goals because I know that if I didn't achieve it now, there was no guarantee that I could. If it's an important enough goal for me, I should continue throughout my life trying to pursue it. There's no reason to give up. And most importantly, I don't feel more honorable than anyone else. Like David says, I'll be lowly in my own eyes when it comes to serving God. I don't have to share how I'm lowly with anybody else, but I have to know that I'm not better than anybody else. And lowliness allows me to not feel superior to anyone else, because truthfully, I'm the only one who knows my true failings. Nobody else knows them. I don't share them with anybody else. None of us do. There's no reason to. But we should know what they are, acknowledge them, and therefore be able to put ourselves in our rightful place, which is that we're not better than anyone else here on earth. Okay, so that's, again, this is a topic that Rav Ginzburg has talked about for the last 50 years, easily. And the very first class that we teach on Jewish psychology is always on this topic, and it's turned into a whole a whole course also. But this is a very short and I think important introduction to this topic of lowliness and to its tremendous importance in building any kind of healthy psyche.